Hello and good evening, good afternoon, or perhaps even good morning, depending on where you are in the world. I'm very happy and now very stressed and happy to be back for the second year of the Solarpunk conference. Once again, we've had a wonderful day of programming, so thank you very much for your patience, and to Case, Lindsay, and Charles, and all of the team that has once again given us an opportunity to learn from one another and to build communities around a diverse set of ideas floating around the Solarpunk ethos. The theme this year has been the rays of resilience, and I think we've seen some really brilliant ways that we can all work together to build a better future. That said, I want to be a little bit critical about the idea of resilience and to encourage us all to push even further. What that means will hopefully become clear as I move through my talk over the next 30 minutes or so. So let's start with this most basic question. What is resilience? We've heard a lot of different ideas about resilience today, and since I'm going to talk about it as being somewhat problematic in a very specific way, I think it's good that we have a common understanding of what we're talking about. So I'll start with the definition of resilience from the Oxford English Dictionary, which includes, as the #1 definition, the action or act of rebounding or springing back, to rebound or recoil. In a later definition, it also includes the quality or fact of being able to recover quickly or easily from or resist being affected by a misfortune, shock, or illness. And so this notion of bouncing back is really inherent to the word resilience. In recent years, the term resilience has become increasingly popular in a wide variety of fields. In this graph, also from the OECD, it shows the growth in the frequency of the use of the word in English publications over time. For example, psychologists have long used resilience to describe the capacity of individuals to withstand major traumatic events, like a Zoom meltdown. Economists measure resilience with regard to the ability of a place to recover from the loss of an industry or key employer. Information technology professionals see resilience as a measure of how well a network can cope with the disruption of service, such as a massive power failure. For engineers and material scientists, resilience is a mechanical process of bouncing back from a perturbation. And for ecologists, resilience is a measure of how much a system can be restored to its original balance following a disruptive event. For myself, as an architect and urban designer, I'm particularly interested in how the concept of resilience relates to cities, because like it or not, our future is destined to be increasingly urbanized, with 68% of the world's population expected to be living in urban areas by 2050, which at that time will account for a projected 6.5 billion people. So I'd also like to share a few examples of how resilience has been defined in relation to cities. For example, the Rockefeller Foundation's City Resilience Index, which was developed with the engineering consultancy Arup, defines city resilience as, quote, the capacity of cities to function so that the people living and working with cities, particularly the poor and vulnerable, survive and thrive no matter what stresses or shocks they encounter. The Intergovernmental Planet on Climate Change, or the IPCC, defines resilience as, quote, the ability of a system and its component parts to anticipate, absorb, accommodate, or recover from the effects of a hazardous event in a timely and efficient manner, including through ensuring the preservation, restoration, or improvement of its essential basic structures and functions. Now, I do want to point out here that this definition does allow for the possibility of an improvement of the system that existed before a disturbance. This is actually very, very rare, and this is where my critique lies. I think that the notion of resilience as bouncing back is particularly problematic, because bouncing back suggests a return to the status quo that existed before a disaster. And why would we want to return to a situation that led to the disaster in the first place, or to a system that simply isn't working or is downright life-threatening for so many people? As Starhawk said this morning, how do we build a new world when people are so deeply damaged by the old one? Virtually none of these understandings of resilience allow for the system to actually change or evolve for the better. They're stuck in the status quo. They don't question why people or cities need to be resilient in order to survive on our changing planet in the first place. And so with that said, before I sort of really get going, I want to share this powerful poster, which proliferated around New Orleans in 2015, and features a quote from Tracy Washington, an African-American civil rights lawyer and the president and CEO of the Louisiana Justice Institute. "Stop calling me resilient," the posters read, "because every time you say, 'Oh, they're resilient,' that means you can do something else to me. I am not resilient." And we need to take this seriously as a society. We need to get to the root causes of the polycrisis, rather than asking people, communities, cities, countries, and the world to keep going on, becoming more and more resilient. The inability to overcome the inertia of this status quo can in many ways be understood as a feature of the dominant global economic system, also known as late-stage capitalism, which has been described as an anti-utopia by the literary critic Darko Suvin, who states that it creates a closed horizon that renders unthinkable the utopia of a better possible world, and therefore stifles the right to dissent, as well as to strive for radical novelty. This anti-utopia thus exists to reinforce the status quo and to disempower vast swaths of society. Why should we bother to act when the mere possibility of a better future is squashed by the powers that be? This anti-utopian tendency is what makes it so hard to think about a better future, what makes even well-intentioned ideas like resilience potentially problematic. And because of this, we as a society have largely failed to get at the root cause of our many problems. And because of this, people like Jim Bohland, Samin Davoudi, and Jennifer Lawrence, the editors of the book seen here, worry that the discourse on resilience and the proliferation of resilience plans around the world run the risk of becoming what they call the resilience machine, and that this machine already operates with such a force that its effects appear natural, predetermined, and incontestable. Furthermore, they worry that if the machine is perpetuated as a tool of economic expansion and capitalist accumulation, as it tends to be, the most vulnerable people, places, and environments will continue to suffer. The risk here is that the deployment of climate-resilient infrastructure may repeat the mistakes of other major infrastructure building programs, from the massive renovations of Paris by Napoleon III and Baron Haussmann in the middle of the 19th century, to the construction of the Interstate Highway System in the United States in the middle of the 20th century, both of which served to intentionally reinforce and exacerbate existing racial and social inequities. The highway system was explicitly utilized as a slum clearance program in cities throughout the country. Like here in this image, Minneapolis, Minnesota, first in 1953, and then again in 2014. Take note not only of the impact of the highway interchanges, but also of entire downtown city blocks being converted into parking lots. Or as we see here in these two images of Atlanta, Georgia. As UCLA professor of Chicano studies, Eric Avila says about this, Black neighborhoods were considered to be blight. They were considered to be slums. The dominant perspective of the time was to eradicate blight, to get rid of the slums. And so these were vibrant neighborhoods in nearly every major city around the country, and they were just wiped off the face of the map under the guise of progress. Another example of this sort of problem is the notion of sacrifice zones like the Cancer Alley in Louisiana that Sanjana mentioned earlier today. And my worry is that this is the direction we're heading once again, as the resilience machine becomes the self-fulfilling prophecy of a hyper-capitalist 21st century. And so with this in mind, I want to suggest a radical rethinking of the concept of resilience, recognizing that decarbonizing our cities is not simply a matter of replacing carbon-burning technologies with cleaner ones, and to show potential paths towards overhauling the exploitative and colonizing socio-technological systems that have developed alongside the urbanization and industrialization of our world. And so now let's shift to discussing how climate fiction and solarpunk imaginaries can both act as warnings against what we want to avoid, and perhaps more importantly, as guides towards the better futures we want to build. I'll start first with the scary bit, with two narratives that explore just how bad things can get if we continue down the path we are heading. The first is the show Extrapolations, created by Scott Burns for Apple TV+. Most people probably haven't seen it, but it had an amazing cast, including Meryl Streep, Kit Harington, Daveed Diggs, Edward Norton, and many more. In my opinion, it's one of the most comprehensive and really moving depictions of what at this time seems to be our most likely climate future. It moved me to tears on multiple occasions. The first scene that I want to share is from the first episode, which features Matthew Rhys, who we see here, as a sort of sleazy real estate developer named Junior Zucker, who's trying to partner with the Elon Musk-like billionaire Nicholas Bilton, the main villain of the series, who's played by Kit Harington, to build a casino resort in the Arctic. In this scene that I'll play for you in just a second, Junior is meeting with one of Bilton's associates to discuss the project. Hopefully you'll be able to hear the dialogue here.
They say ice sheet in Greenland is going to break down the middle. 79N ice sheet.
Right, we'll build there next.
They say 3-meter sea level rise by the end of the century.
They also said the same thing about Miami. All we did was make a fortune retrofitting the buildings, and guess what? When it goes up another couple of inches, we'll retro-fucking-fit again and make even more money. Here's what you need to know about global warming. It will all go to shit at the end of the century, 100%. We'll be dead. We'll have to miss it. But we'll be smiling in gold-plated coffins designed by Kanye.
So we see here, hopefully you could hear it, climate disaster simply seen as an opportunity to make more and more money. The second scene discusses a similar theme from the show's final episode, in which Kit Harington's character, again, sort of standing in for Elon Musk, stands trial for ecocide in the International Criminal Court. Here, his former employee, played by Ed Norton, testifies about how climate change was understood as a money-making scheme.
Just admit it. You said it over and over. It didn't matter how high the carbon levels got, because one day you were going to make a machine that could suck it out of the atmosphere. And you said on that day, the more CO2 that's up there, the more money you can make eliminating it. You called it a fucking vacuum cleaner for wealth.
Carbon drawdown as a vacuum cleaner for wealth. I think that kind of sums it up. The second climate narrative that I want to share is by an author who most solarpunks are probably aware of, Andrew Dana Hudson. His 2022 book, Our Shared Storm, is really interesting. And it's maybe less of a novel, as the cover of the book suggests, and more of a thought experiment played out through 5 interrelated novellas. Each of the 5 stories in the book takes place in the same time and place, Buenos Aires in the year 2054, which in the story is the site of the yearly COP, or the Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, which, as you may know, is the official negotiating process for attempting to limit the dangerous effects of climate change. Hudson's 5 stories have an overlapping cast of characters that are dramatically different according to the world that they've grown up in inside the story, which are modeled by Hudson on the 5 shared socioeconomic pathways, or SSPs, which the IPCC has actually developed as a way to understand different climate scenarios, depending upon how the world decides to act or not act. And the story out of this book that I want to discuss here is chapter 2 in the book, which follows SSP 5, which is categorized as fossil fuel development, or taking the highway, which is essentially just continuing on down the pathway that we're on now, and also the path followed in the show Extrapolations. In this version of the future, the resilience machine has run amok, with hyper-capitalists salivating at the opportunities to profit from climate disasters. The COP has evolved into a massive trade show of sorts, described in this quote, with exhibitions from companies vying for climate disaster capital. In this future, the UN's focus is on continued and unending economic growth and redevelopment after disaster, rather than on mitigating or trying to stop the effects of climate change. A large portion of this story consists of the local booth boy character, Luis, who's helping the California tech bro character, Noah Campbell, pitch his company ARC to Dia Kapoor, an Indian woman described as a major climate capital thinkfluencer, who is staging a sort of Shark Tank-like reality show where entrepreneurs compete for funding. I want to read a short excerpt of Luis's pitch to Dia. Luis says, "We're prophets with an actionable message about tomorrow. Climate adaptation is the biggest business in the world, but every year we see more major, low likelihood weather events outside of traditional almanac patterns, so-called never storms. When never storms hit, cities too often aren't prepared and haven't made the proper investments to capitalize on the market opportunities climate shakeups bring. Our story is those missed opportunities. We see amazing markets like Manila and Karachi not getting the redevelopment they deserve, and we think we want to do it better." He then continues on. He says, "The UNFCCC has embraced redevelopment as a core principle of moving forward into this climate era, but we really need to be doing pre-redevelopment. Storms only work as economic drivers if you have the equipment and capital standing by to move in as soon as the clouds clear and a special redevelopment zone is declared. That's why never storms are so devastating. ARC, their company, helps firms and states, even individual households, know when and where to lay that groundwork so they can make the most of climate opportunities when they come. Climate disaster as economic drivers." In my mind, these two narratives show where we're heading under the paradigm of what has become known as green growth. Inherent to green growth is the almost exclusive focus on technological solutions to climate change, and oftentimes on technologies that don't even exist yet. Within my fields of architecture and urban design, this is actually where we tend to focus, with the idea that we can save the world by designing better, more efficient buildings and cities. This approach is epitomized by what Danish megastar architect Bjarke Ingels has called hedonistic sustainability, a term which he coined in a 2011 TED Talk. He suggests that the traditional narrative of sustainability is one of sacrifice. He says, quote, "Sustainability can't be some kind of moral sacrifice, a political dilemma, or even a philanthropic cause. Instead, he tells us it has to be a design challenge, which of course then enables him to be our savior. This approach is embodied by his famous design for the Copenhill, a waste-to-energy plant with an artificial ski slope on its roof outside of Copenhagen. He says of the project, it's a crystal clear example of hedonistic sustainability, that a sustainable city is not only better for the environment, it's also more enjoyable for the lives of its citizens. Okay, great. A more sustainable city will make the lives of its citizens better. Agreed. But building a building to burn trash to make energy and then putting a ski slope on the top of it, I don't think does that. This is clearly what economists would call a green growth scenario. We can continue growing, continue producing, continue consuming, and as long as we adopt better technologies, everything will be okay. But under a green growth future, everything will only be okay in the sense that everything is okay in artist K.C. Green's famous On Fire comic that has generated countless memes. The world is literally on fire, and we have to make some major changes. So, what is the alternative? There are two interrelated ideas that I want to focus on as alternatives today: degrowth and library socialism. And I want to use some Solarpunk narratives to help tease out what these ideas might mean for society. I'll start with the idea of degrowth as an alternative to our current capitalist hegemony. I highly recommend watching this debate on YouTube that was sponsored by Oxford University in September of 2022 between Jason Hickel, seen here on the left, arguing in favor of degrowth, and Sam Fankhauser on the right, arguing in favor of green growth, which was also then moderated by Kate Rayworth of Donut Economics fame. It's essentially a primer for articulating the differences between degrowth and green growth. I don't have time today to unpack the intricacies of the degrowth agenda, but at its base, as Jason Hickel explains, it's about how we can shift from an economy that's organized around domination and extraction to one that's rooted in reciprocity with the living world. One of the primary ways of doing this is decoupling economic growth, especially growth as measured by gross domestic product or GDP, from our understanding of human welfare. These ideas happen to be very closely aligned with ideas of climate justice and the just transition to a post-carbon world. And there are ideas that are shared by Solarpunk as both a movement and a genre. And Solarpunk narratives can illustrate methods through which we might deconstruct the extractive society of today in both conceptual and literal ways. The short story Caught Root by Julia Patt, which is featured in the collection Glass and Gardens, Solarpunk Summers, embodies this degrowth versus green growth debate through the trope of an outsider visiting a different society and learning its ways. In this case, the narrator, Dr. Ewan Orkney, is a botanist from the techno-utopian city of Hillside, whose shining towers reach for the sky. The narrative follows Ewan's interactions with Dr. Barry Kadir of the decidedly low-tech city of New Ur, which is all adobe and stucco and low-sitting buildings. Orkney recognizes that both settlements have the same goal, that is, to reimagine civilization. And their exchange starts off a bit cagey, with Ewan suggesting, "We're not so different, you know? Aesthetically, we might appear to be opposites, but we share the same goals." To which Kadir replies, "Not entirely. Hillside doesn't care about searching our past for solutions. It's all new, new, new. The shinier, the better." For me, the most interesting observation that the narrator in the story makes of the differences between the two settlements is that, quote, "where Hillside is climate controlled, New Ur adapts to the seasons, shifting work schedules with the demands of summer and winter, and that the people of New Ur spend the hot afternoons resting in the shade in quiet contemplation." This is important to note because it illustrates one possible solution to a climate problem that does not rely on energy use. Instead, it relies on a subtle shifting of societal norms that not only decreases energy consumption, but also has the potential for increasing human happiness. As the narrator notes, here they use less to begin with, no need for extra tech. Climate activist Thelma Young Latuna Tabua likens the emergence of a post-carbon world to giving birth. As any parent knows, the arrival of a new baby requires us to adapt to new needs, new rhythms, and to be alive to new possibilities. Today, I want to suggest that the new needs of a decarbonized society may require us to adapt to new rhythms of life, especially slower ones that will bring about new possibilities. And these are far from new ideas. Oftentimes, there are already indigenous and vernacular ways of being in the world that can help to light the way. Things like Spanish siestas and traditional Middle Eastern houses that are flexibly designed to allow for use to change according to changing temperatures. And the residents in New Ur, in Pat's story, have adopted slower rhythms of life that reject the toxic hustle culture of today. This is also an idea explored in one of my favorite Solarpunk stories, The Scent of the Freetails by Deji Bryce Olokaton, which I don't have time to get into today. These notions of slowing down and degrowth as an economic system are also explored in books like Kim Stanley Robinson's Pacific Edge and Cory Doctorow's Walk Away and the Lost Cause. And The Lost Cause describes a near future that exists largely under a degrowth paradigm. There's universal basic income, there's a federal job guarantee, factories only operate when there's an actual need for the good that they produce, there's communal living with communal childcare, and there's library socialism, or a sharing economy, which brings me to the second alternative that I wanted to discuss. Aaron Moritz and Sean Vulliez, the hosts of the Seriously Wrong podcast, have probably done the most to attempt to define a system of what they call library socialism. Their idea is based on the concept of usufruct. As they describe it, the right of usufruct means you can use things, but you cannot deny them to others when you're not using them, and you do not have the right to destroy them to prevent others from using them. This essentially results in a society centered around sharing a common wealth that decreases inequality, reduces redundant goods, thus decreasing extraction of raw materials and reducing the ecological footprint of society. A short story that highlights the potentials of a library-based economy is D.A. Baden's awards ceremony, in which the main character, a woman named Mei Lin, is the creator of and screenwriter for an award-winning television drama. Without giving the story away, in the later seasons of the show, the characters shift from a materialistic worldview to one that sees the development of a shared economy. As the story describes, ownership was increasingly portrayed as a burden, not a benefit. Borrowing became the new buying. So sharing is fundamental. It's one of the most important lessons we teach our children, but unfortunately, it's something that we tend to move away from in adulthood. In their book, Sharing Cities, Duncan McLaren and Julian Agyeman argue in favor of a sharing paradigm that just might be the seed of a post-capitalist society. In their articulation of the sharing paradigm, they suggest that we're already doing things in multiple dimensions, and that we can share things like cars, tools, and books, but we can also share less tangible things like solar power. We can share services like the co-creation of play spaces and public spaces, cooperative childcare, and crowdfunding. We can share activities like leisure, but perhaps more importantly, political activity in the form of rallies and protests, but also in the form of participatory governance through processes like participatory budgeting. And we can share space through things like co-housing and co-working. And one of the most important ways that we need to learn to share is to equitably share the world with non-human living things, both plants and animals, through ideas like biologist E.O. Wilson's Half-Earth Project. So in conclusion, what ideas like degrowth and library socialism, as well as countless other ideas about reorganizing society in radical ways that run through the Solarpunk body of work, what they offer is an opportunity to reframe the discourse on resilience as something far more radical than bouncing back to the status quo. As suggested by Keith Shaw, another scholar of resilience, rather than viewing resilience as bouncing back to an original state following an external shock, the term should be seen in terms of bouncing forward, reacting to crises by changing to a new state that's more sustainable. And so we must ignore the suggestions of people like Margaret Thatcher that there is no alternative to capitalism. For as the great Ursula K. Le Guin reminds us, yes, we live in capitalism and its power seems inescapable, but then so did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings, and resistance and change often begin in art. And so finally, I'll close with the words of Murray Bookchin: be practical, do the impossible. Because if you don't do the impossible, we're going to wind up with the unthinkable, and that will be the destruction of the planet itself. So to do the impossible is the most rational and practical thing we can do. Thank you so much for bearing with the disastrous beginning of this. And thank you again to our organizers.